Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, May 26, 2025, and our friend Colonel Jacques is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you very much for having me again on your show. Thank you.
Colonel, right now, Europe is dealing with two major conflicts. One of them is much closer to the boundaries or to Europe itself, is the conflict in Ukraine. But the other one, which is far away, not that much far away, is in the Middle East. And here is what the conservative leader Kemi Badenoch in the United Kingdom said on Sky News about the conflict in the both conflict, but focused on the conflict in the Middle East.
The language of the Prime Minister
I'm not
of
asking
Israel.
you to police it. I'm asking
what he has said.
People need to know where you stand.
Yeah, but I've been very clear where I stand. Hamas is a terrorist group. They are not our friends.
I'm talking about what
Trevor,
you think about the Israelis'
Yes, but it's all related. Who funds Hamas? Iran, an enemy of this country. An enemy of this country. Israel is fighting a proxy war on behalf of the UK, just like Ukraine is on behalf of the Western Europe against Russia. We have to get serious. We have to get serious. There was a terrorist plot in London against the Israeli embassy. We saw two Jewish members of the Israeli embassy in DC killed. Whose side are we on? We need to make sure that the hostages are returned. No one wants to see a war in Gaza. Palestinians are suffering. Netanyahu is complaining that he thinks our leaders are carrying out the wrong action. He has every right to say that. What I want to see is Keir Starmer making sure that he is on the right side of British national interest. That cannot be on the side of Hamas.
Yeah, on the rights of the British national interest, and this is a proxy war in the Middle East. Your take, Colonel?
Well, I think we are witnessing right now a series of narrative that emerge because we see that Israel has been, in fact, defeated by the Palestinians in Palestine, in the sense that all the objectives that they were to achieve was not achieved by the government of Israel, and in that sense, this is a defeat. This is exactly what I think Winston Churchill used to say, that if you are not winning a war such as this one, then you are just defeated. There is no possibility. This is the kind of war where the Palestinians are victorious. And we have a similar situation in Ukraine, in the sense that the idea was to weaken Russia, and the narrative we have heard in the last 3 years was precisely that Russia had no weapons anymore, no ammunition anymore, and they had no effective command and control organization. They were defeated, the sanctions were working, the economy is collapsing, and so on and so forth. And in both cases, we see that, in fact, everything we have said in the past 3 years is false. And now we try to save face, if you want, by having new narrative that it was a proxy war in Palestine, that Russians only involved, and so on, Iran, and so on and so forth. And in Ukraine, we have exactly a similar type of negotiation. Now it's, of course, in the West, especially in Europe, since the Europeans, they never liked Trump very much. And now they are saying that Trump is doing the work of Putin. So we live in completely distorted realities. The West is unable to understand the root causes of the problems. That applies to Palestine as it applies to Ukraine. The issue of a population in Palestine, we're talking about Palestinians. In Ukraine, we are talking about the ethnic Russians in Ukraine, who are somehow oppressed by a government, the government who is supposed to protect them, That's Israel, because I remind you that according to the Geneva Convention, Israel is supposed to protect the Palestinians because it's an occupied territory. And in that sense, as occupying power, the Israel is has the obligation of protecting the Palestinians, but it doesn't. Obviously not. That's acknowledged by all accounts of the UN and other organizations. So we have the case in Palestine, and in Ukraine we have exactly the same thing. You can think whatever you want about the Russians in Ukraine. The fact of the matter is that their rights, I mean, this population, the Russians, were stripped of their rights in February 2014. And that's the reason why they started this kind of rebellion. And instead of finding a solution, I mean, the solution was there. So instead of implementing the solution that was provided by the Minsk agreement, the Ukrainian government kept shooting at its own population, because the Russians in the two Republic of Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk, were in fact Ukrainian citizens. So in both cases, you have a government in Tel Aviv and in Kiev, on the other hand, who are responsible for a population, and they don't assume this responsibility, and they fire at the population. We have exactly the same situation. That's exactly what prompted the Palestinians to make this operation in October, on the 7th of October, 2023. And in Ukraine, that's exactly what prompted the Russians to intervene on the 24th of February, 2022. These are the reasons. And of course, there are other aspects that came for Ukraine, the issue of NATO and all that, which come into addition. But the reason why, I repeat, and I will keep saying and repeating that the reason why Russia intervened in Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022 is because the Ukrainians were preparing an offensive against the population of Donbass. And this offensive has been started to be planned on the 24th of March 2021, as Zelensky issued this decree to reoccupy Crimea and the south of the country. Period. That's as simple as that. So we have a very similar situation in both cases. The problem is that in both cases, those who the West is claiming are the weakest ones, the delinquent ones, the evil ones, and so on, at the end, they are winning. And that's exactly the problem. And now we are trying, because we had this narrative of Palestinians. Nobody talks about the rights of Palestinians, by the way. Nobody talks about the way Israel took over, in fact, the whole territory of Israel. I remind you that there is not a single square meter of Israel that has been given to the Jews. Not a single square meter. The resolution of November 1947 asked for a referendum in order to have this opportunity to create two states, or to stay in the same situation. That means one state with two populations. Since the Israeli didn't want that, they simply took arms already at the end of 1947, before being declared as independent, and they took over the country. So there is not a single square meter that has been given, which has been legally taken by Israel. In addition to that, those territories, such as Gaza and the West Bank, these are considered as occupied territories, And according to a resolution of the UN General Assembly of July last year, Israel has to leave these territories and to let Palestinians live in these countries. The problem in these areas, problem is that Israel has made every effort to settle in these areas that don't belong to Israel, and to occupy not just militarily, but also by settling civilians there in order to literally occupy the territory. And incidentally, the international community was requested by the UN to help Israel to vacate those territories. Nota bene, not a single country has, Western country at least, has taken any measure to implement this resolution. And in the West, in Ukraine, we have, as I mentioned before, we had the Minsk agreement, the first one that collapsed because of the Ukrainians, by the way. That was in September 2014. Was the second round that was signed by the Ukrainians in February 2015. This is the Minsk II agreement that was turned into a UN Security Council resolution. That means approved by all the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So meaning that basically this resolution should have the support of the 5 Ps, as we call them. And in addition to that, the document that was signed in Minsk in February 2014 was signed, of course, by the Ukrainians and the leaders of the 2 republics it was not republics, the 2 oblasts of Donetsk and Lugansk. They were not republic at that time, and they were guaranteed by 2 Western countries on the Western side. That means France and Germany, and guarantees by the Russians on the other side. In fact, the only country that respected the agreement was Russia. And we are always in the same scheme. The West signs agreements, but as soon as those agreements don't suit their political objectives or the policy of the moment, they just discard and make as if these agreements didn't exist. And that's exactly what creates a problem. And we have the same problem in both cases, Palestine, in Ukraine. We have conflicts that are in fact created by the fact that the West has not respected international law. In addition to those countries like Ukraine, who started shooting at its own population, and Israel that started shooting at the population it's supposed to protect. And it does it continuously since 1948. So nothing really new there. But the core problem and the root causes of both problems is precisely that the West, or those who are considered as part of the Western world, such as Israel, do not respect international law. This is as simple as that. And therefore, of course, then you have behaviors. Then you can ask and say that Hamas is a terrorist. But again, terrorist. I mean, my uncle, who used to be in the French resistance during World War II, fighting against the Germans, was also considered as a terrorist by the Germans. And today, the idea or the word terrorist is used just as it suits people or not. Take Mohammed al-Jalani, the head of the Syrian government, who used to be terrorist, recognized as such by the UN even, who had a bounty of $10 million on his head. was still received by Western powers, was welcomed by the Germans, the French, and so on, although is officially considered as terrorist. I remind you that the Hamas is not considered as a terrorist movement by the UN, as an example. So when this British politician used the word terrorist, this is just her own mind, or the mind of the British government. But that's it. And then when they want to talk to Jara or Al-Sara, as his name is today, I mean, they just dropped the word terrorist.
I call him Al-Shara.
Al-Shara, sorry. Yes, thank you. I remember even well, Al-Jolani, because it's Al-Golani, in fact. It comes from the Golan, which is, by the way, also illegally annexed by Israel. The Golan doesn't belong to Israel. It's, according to international law, the Golan belongs to Syria. And by the way, this is still a contentious issue between Syria, even the new government, and Israel. So we see that the West is constantly breaching international law, and then it complains when people start taking arms against them. This is just insane. We go, we bomb them. We bombed Afghanistan, we bombed Iraq, Syria, Libya, you name it. And now we don't feel comfortable when they react. This is just, if it were not tragic, it's comic. It would be comical, because it's so insane, inconsistent, illogic, that we are exactly in a situation where we create our own problems. And when we talk about both conflicts, we could add Iran, by the way, but okay, when we talk about those open conflicts, let's say, we see that the narrative is evolving, but always in the same direction, by the way. There is no self-correction process. It continues in the wrong direction. And at the same time, we see that in our own countries, we have increasing problems. Exactly with the same thing, by the way, with the rule of law. We have censorship. We have increased. Then, for instance, in France, if you demonstrate in favor of Palestine, you can be charged with the accusation of supporting terrorism. You know, this is just insane. And of course, you had those French politicians who used to say, for instance, that Hamas is Islamist, the Islamic State is Islamist, and since the Islamic State attacked France in 2015 and 16, then Hamas attacked France. You see, this kind of reasoning that are completely stupid, that doesn't make any sense. It made even less sense that the Islamic State considered Hamas as enemy. That comes into addition to that. So not only we have politicians who don't know the matter, really, they are simply ignorant, stupid and ignorant. But in addition to that, they create kind of a conspiracy theory in order to make to accuse the Hamas to be a direct enemy of France. And there is the single shred of evidence that Hamas conducted terrorist activities outside of Palestine. And in fact, they have pledged that they would take military action in Palestine only, for a simple reason. They have acknowledged that what the Palestinians did in the 60s and the 70s, at the time when they were Marxists. So it's important to remember that the Palestinian resistance in the late 50s up to the mid 70s. I mean, I could say even the 80s. They were Marxist essentially, and a lot of Palestinians at that time were trained in the Warsaw Pact, and they had special training for the use of explosives and all that. And they also conducted, and that's the result of the famous or infamous a conference of the Habana in Cuba in 1966, the so-called Tricontinental Conference, that in fact established that all the movements which were rebelling against the Western imperialism were fighting the same fight. So it was not a nationalist fight, it was an internationalist fight. And therefore, that's the reason why you had, for instance, Irish resistance being trained in Libya or in South America, or you had Irish fighter training the armed forces of Colombia, especially in the use of explosive and special techniques and things like that. All these movements were cooperating together. There was a book that was written in the 70s, I think, by a journalist called Claire Sterling, and that was the terrorist network or the terror network, and it explained all these relationships that you had at that time between all these this movement. And in that context, you had the Palestinian then terrorists, of course. They used terrorists activities to hijack aircraft and things like this around the world. You even had Swissair at that time, was the Swissair aircraft, airliners hijacked and exploded in Jordan or things like this. So you had really, the Palestinians were not limited to just Palestine. And as Yasser Arafat obtained international recognition, and in particular as he was not welcomed, but received at the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York, he pledged not to conduct international terrorism anymore. And from that point on, the Palestinians limited their action against the Israeli occupation. The problem is that the West is conveniently forgetting that in order to keep this idea that the Palestinians are also attacking the West. And that's exactly what this French politician, it's a right-wing politician anyway, so, but extreme right-wing. It's not just right-wing, because right-wing per se is not a problem, but when it's extreme, then it starts to be a problem. And that's exactly what he said, that the Palestinians were in fact attacking France. This is totally false. The Palestinians, since the late 70s, early 80s, are limited their action against the occupying force, and namely Israel. So that's absolutely normal. And by the way, you have a resolution of the United Nations that explains clearly that the fight of the Palestinians against the occupation is legitimate, and it's also legitimate to use arms to fight in their fight for resistance. So not only the fight of the Palestinians is legitimate according to the UN, but it's also legitimate for the Palestinians to use arms against the Israelis. So when we talk about terrorists, In fact, this lady is doing exactly what the Nazi were saying to my uncle 80 years ago. My uncle was a resistant. He resisted against a military occupation, exactly as the Palestinians do today. So, if we recognize or acknowledge that in the West, if we were aware of that, and if we could advise Israel, as you advise an old friend, to find a constructive solution for that, Israel would not be in that trouble. The problem is that we don't do that. And we didn't do that for Ukraine either. In fact, we did worse. We even prompted this country to react in the wrong direction. What happens is that Israel now is considered as a rogue state because it's not applying the international law. And we have discussed already, even if we may have different opinion about that, but nevertheless, we see that for now, we have, let's say, what we call in French a refroidissement. That means it's the relationship between Israel and the US is getting colder. And we see exactly the same thing happening with Ukraine. So we have led these countries in the wrong direction simply because, as to the Middle East conflict, the Westerners have a stronger racism against Arabs than they have against Jews. And for the Ukrainian conflict, they just have more Russophobia than Ukrainophobia, because they don't respect the Ukrainians. Remember what Lindsey Graham said when he said that the fight that Ukraine was conducting was a very good deal for the US, because so the US can fight Russia without spending any American life. Meaning that basically what he's saying is that the Ukrainians are doing our dirty job. Is that the respect for a country? Is that the respect for a nation? Absolutely not. So we are in this situation. We just hate Arabs more than Jews, and we just hate Russians more than Ukrainians. That's the only explanation for that. And that's not very glorious for the West. When we talk about values and all that, what are we talking about?
Colonel, when we talk about the conflict in Ukraine, as you've mentioned, we thought that the situation somehow, because of the Israeli lobby in the United States and the difficulties of what's going on in the Middle East, the situation in Ukraine would be much easier to deal with on the part of the Trump administration. Donald Trump, look at what Donald Trump is doing somehow, as you've mentioned, the relationship between the United States and Ukraine is not getting stronger. It's just getting weaker as time goes by. But it doesn't seem that Donald Trump himself has some sort of realistic understanding of what's going on in Ukraine. Because his latest post on the social truth, he said that I've always had a very good relationship, he said, Donald Trump says, relationship with Vladimir Putin of Russia, but something has happened to him. He has gone absolutely crazy. He is needlessly killing a lot of people. And I'm just talking about soldiers. And what is in the mind of Donald Trump himself when he goes this way on Vladimir Putin? If he talked with Vladimir Putin, he had a phone call, more than 2 hours they talked to each other, and he comes out and just putting on his social on his social network a post that is just putting the blame on Putin because they're not achieving anything in Ukraine. Your take on what's going on with the United States under Donald Trump?
Well, first of all, the first step when you try to solve a conflict, regardless of the size of the conflict, can be personal or international. The first step is first to understand what is at stake for both parties. And the issue is that for some reason, we are totally unable to understand the Russian position. We still consider that Putin wants to gain territory, while the essence of the Russian intervention, as I said before, the essence of the intervention was to protect the population of Donbass, period. And of course, the problem is that we have some interference with other aspects. For instance, even in the West, a lot of people who are pro-Russian consider that the reason for Putin to come into Ukraine was NATO. It's not exactly that. The background remains NATO, and it's true, but this is not the reason why the Russians intervened. And to understand the rationale there, we have to go back to this interview that I mentioned several times on your channel and others, which is this interview of Alexei Arestovich of the 18th March 2019, where he explains that if Ukraine wants to enter NATO, it has to defeat Russia first, because they are in conflict, and NATO will never accept to a member which is already in conflict. Therefore, they need to defeat Russia first. And in order to defeat Russia first, they need to have a war with Russia. And when asked when this war would be, Alexei Arestovich, and I remind you that at that time, Arestovich was the main personal advisor of Zelensky. And he explained this war will happen in 2021, 2022. And that's the rationale. That means that for some reason, the Ukrainians convinced themselves that by having a war with Russia, and with the help of the sanctions applied by the West, the massive and brutal sanctions provided by the West, Russia would collapse very quickly. And that's the whole basic idea. And that's the reason why. I mean, this idea of Ukraine who might be member of NATO and things like this, this was raised at the Lisbon meeting of the NATO meeting, if I'm not wrong. That was in 2008. But at that time, Russia didn't react, didn't make any counter proposal or things like this. That did not even happen in 2014. As you had all the Maidan and all that, and you had this pledge for NATO that came again and again between 2014 and 2021. So the Russian didn't do anything, but just at the end of 2021, namely on the 17th of December 2021, they sent two papers, one to NATO and one to the United States, to say, don't accept Ukraine, or better said, tell officially that you will not accept Ukraine in NATO. Because, and that was the point, because since Ukraine was convinced that by having a war with Russia, this would lead to the membership to NATO, they were ready to take the risk. And that's the reason why on the 24th of March, 2021, Zelensky issued the decree to recover Crimea and the south of the country. And that's the reason why Ukraine started to build up its forces against the Donbass. And they had an operation that was scheduled for the beginning of 2022. And the Russians understood that, and they understood also the rationale behind this. And the idea of having this reaction, not in 2014, in 2015, or in 2019, or whatever, but in 2021, it's because they realized that the Ukrainians took seriously the idea of trying to defeat Russia in order to access NATO. And that's the reason why at this particular moment, the Russians took the initiative to send these papers that were considered by the West and Western media as ultimatums. But they were not ultimatums. They were a way to tell the Ukrainians, because the interesting thing is that, and that was even said by Zelensky himself in March 2022 to CNN, he said, I asked Biden to tell me if we will be member of NATO or not. And the response he received was, Ukraine will not be member of NATO, but officially, openly, will say the door will remain open. But you will not be member. Meaning that that's exactly what the Russians understood. And that's the reason why they made this attempt in December 2021 to tell the Ukrainians that regardless of what the kind of operation you are preparing, you will not be member of NATO. Thus, removing the rationale for Ukraine to start a war with Russia, because they knew that if they were attacking Donbass, the Russians would intervene, as the Russians have done in 2008 in Georgia. I remind you that in Georgia, we had exactly the same scenario, that the government started to bomb the Russian minority in South Ossetia, thus prompting the intervention of Russia. So the Ukrainians knew exactly that if they started to make an operation, a massive operation against Donbass, this would trigger an operation from Russia. And the Russians tried to make the whole reverse engineering of that. And that's the reason why this issue of NATO came to the surface. But the essence of the reason for intervention is to protect the population of Donbass. And that's also the reason why the 4 regions that are now occupied by Russia will not be given back to Ukraine. And just to illustrate my point, it's probably important to see, and I have here probably just as an example, sorry. Here we go. This is the law that was adopted by the Ukrainian parliament in July, on the 1st of July 2021. And this MP, the MP of the Rada, the Rada of Kiev, said on the 2nd of July, so one day after the adoption of the law, and he said, at the legal level, Russians are not indigenous people, so they will not be able to fully enjoy all human rights and fundamental freedoms defined by the norms of international law, as well as those provided for in the Constitution and laws of Ukraine, unlike Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, Karaites, and Krimchaks. So meaning that you have the Russians were considered as second-class citizens. And they are still considered as second-class citizens by the laws of Ukraine. In that context, how do you want Russia to return those territories where you have ethnic Russians living? They will not, and they have explained that, by the way. The problem is that nobody mentioned this law. And this law is a similar pattern, not as strong, but it's a similar pattern as the one that were adopted in 1935 by the Germans against the Jews. The so-called Nuremberg laws were exactly the same idea. That means that your rights are defined not by what you're doing, but by who you are. And that's exactly the same thing here. In most countries, in Western countries, and countries where you have the rule of law, in essence, all the citizens are entitled for the same rights, regardless of their color of skin and their religion and their political beliefs and so on. But here, no, it's exactly that. And for that reason, and that's exactly what the Russians understand as Nazification, denazification. It's to extract the Russians from laws that are in fact unjust and do not respect the human rights. And that's exactly what we have today. The problem is that we are never understanding that. And I don't even know if Trump knows that. As a result, if you don't understand the context, then it's easy to think that Putin is extremist, radical, and things like this. But if you look at exactly what I explained, then you would say, well, the Russians are right to do so. Because if instead of the word Russian, you would have the word American, Swiss, French, or whatever, who would accept that in a country your ethnic group would have an inferior status as the other, just simply because of the DNA? You see? So this is something that, of course, is ignored by the media. But that's the rationale behind the whole conflict. And of course, then people turn that in the sense that, oh, that's Russian propaganda. No, it's not propaganda. And if you come back to this document, you will see that this is Ukrainian media. In fact, this is APNU in originally, I put it here. This is a version, or maybe I can. Oh, sorry. Sorry. I will come back here, and oh, sorry. I can find there is the Ukrainian version of that. Oh, sorry. I will. It's too cumbersome to do it here. But this is a text from Ukrainian media, and this was said by a Ukrainian parliamentarian. It's not Russian or Putin or whoever. So the problem is that we just want to ignore and we discard what is inconvenient for us. What is inconvenient for the narrative, we simply discarded. And then, of course, we consider the others as crazy because they don't think as we do. The problem is that the perception we have is totally different from the perception they have, because they have the comprehensive picture and we have only a limited picture. And that's exactly where we are. And that's the reason why this conflict in Ukraine is more difficult to solve than expected. Because our assumptions for the conflict are not exactly the ones that are understood by the Ukrainians and by the Russians. As a result, we cannot accommodate both. And that's exactly the weakness. We have mentioned that several times on your channel. Is exactly the weakness of the Trump team, especially Keith Kellogg, because he failed to understand the real context of the conflict. And his proposal that he come, and which is basically the same proposal that comes again and again, and that got the support with some modification by the Europeans and so on. This solution, with quotation marks, is a solution that in fact respond to the way Americans understand the conflict, not the way the conflict is waged on the ground. And I repeat, I'm from strategic intelligence, and the motto in intelligence is that from the way you understand a conflict comes the way you solve it. If you don't understand it properly, you will not solve it properly. And that applies to any kind of a conflict. It can be private, it can be a personal issue, as it can be an international issue. If you don't try to understand what is really at stake for both parties, there is no chance we'll solve it. And that's exactly the case in which we are. In addition to that, there are more functional issues, because you asked about Trump, and Trump has, at least we can say, the positive aspect of his approach is that at least he would like to solve the problem, which is exactly what the Europeans don't want to do, by the way. So at least Trump would like to change things. And he has an objective, that you have the guns silent in Ukraine. And probably his real objective is having the US out of the conflict. That's probably the real rationale for him to act. But in any case, he has an objective, has an idea, but he has no strategy to address that. He doesn't know how to address the problem, because he didn't get what the problem is exactly. As a result, you have this back and forth type of approach. He changed mind. One day Putin is a great guy, the next day he's a crazy, and one day is in favor of the solution proposed by Putin, the next day it's a solution proposed by Zelensky, and so on. So it's impossible to have any kind of consistent approach. And the Russians understand that. By the way, this is exactly the same thing you have when we talk about the trade war with China and others. You have tariffs on one day, then they're reduced the next day, and they're reinstored the third day. So, you know, how can you have this kind of messy management? This is a type of management without a strategy. The strategy is your line of conduct, if you want. You have an objective, and the way to address this objective is defined by your strategy. Problem is that when you don't have a strategy, then you have a kind of erratic path to reach the objective. And we are exactly in that type of situation. As a result, both in economic terms as in political terms or strategic terms when it comes to the conflict, we see that the whole policy of Trump, despite being based on good ideas, they fail to be implemented properly because he has no strategist, and probably there are competing strategies within the administration. Those who would prefer to confront Russia, those who would prefer not to confront at all, and things like this. I mean, we can probably argue, but apparently you have those differences between Rubio, Kellogg, and others within the administration, making the thing even more complex. But the reality is that you have absolutely no strategy to address the objectives. And when you go in the European area, I mean, if you look at the Europeans, they don't have any objective, and they don't have a strategy. Well, If you don't have an objective, it's logic that you cannot have a strategy, because the strategy essentially is how you address, how you reach the objective. So if you don't have an objective, that you, mathematically speaking, you don't have a strategy. And that's exactly what's happening. And you have on the European side, the only thing they know is that they want to weaken Russia. And that's exactly what Kaja Kallas said, Ursula von der Leyen said, what Macron said, and Keir Starmer said. And these are the dominant voices currently in Europe. Meaning that basically, to address the conflict in Ukraine, you don't have consistency, or you have a consistent inconsistency, because nobody is able to articulate any kind of approach to the conflict. The Europeans simply don't want a solution. And they don't care because Ukrainians are dying. Ukrainians are dying. Not not French soldiers or Poles, or even they don't want to. I mean, even the Poles don't want to send soldiers in Ukraine. So you have a situation where nobody, in fact, wants to be involved in the conflict, but they play in the background in order to have a situation that makes. I don't know if I showed you this diagram or this graph about the fatalities for the conflict. I'm not sure I showed it, but I can show it for you. But this is a comparison of the fatalities based on documents that are Ukraine. These are in blue. You have the Ukrainian fatalities, and these are based on calculation made by a Ukrainian site that makes this calculation. And in red, you have a calculation. I say calculation because this is partly based on algorithm that used to be based on observations, but apparently it's also combined with some kind of algorithm or artificial intelligence. But this is made by Mediazona, which is an opposition website in cooperation with the British BBC. So nothing with the Russian government, on the contrary. And you have here, if I take the figures, I mean, I could have taken more, but I just limited to a few numbers. If you take the figures provided by Mediazona, today you should have around 100,000 fatalities. We're talking about fatality. I mean, here it's casualties. Here in Mediazona, we're talking about casualties. We assume probably most of them are fatalities. And here for the Ukrainians, this is the Ukrainian website. I mean, an NGO that makes that calculation. I said calculation because it's partly based on algorithms, and recently they have changed the algorithms. And that's the reason why you have this dotted line here, because they assume the website itself, or the organization itself, assume that the current algorithm gives something like 15% too much casualties. So the dotted line would be the real one today. But it's interesting to say that in the first part of the line, you have kind of consistency with the figures given by Ursula von der Leyen of the European Union. She mentioned in September 2022, 100,000 dead Ukrainians. The Mossad, the Israeli Mossad, mentioned 157,000 fatalities for Ukraine, while the NGO at that time had 155. So very close, a very similar number. And a very well-known journalist in in Ukraine mentioned in that was in September 2023 the figure of 285,000 dead Ukrainians, and the calculation was almost the same. It was almost like 280,000. So we can see that this NGO is probably very close to the reality, and that shows the difference. But that shows also that we have a huge difference between the Ukrainian fatalities and the Russian ones. And the problem is here, when you see those two lines and you see this idea of the Europeans to avoid any kind of negotiation with the Russians, then we see that the Europeans are in a total delusion when it comes to the conflict. Again, I cannot certify that these figures for both countries are reliable or 100% reliable, but at least they give an idea of the difference. And even Danilov, who used to be the secretary of the Ukrainian Security Council, he said that the casualties between Russians and Ukrainians were in a ratio of 1 to 7. And here, if you have something like probably 700,000 casualties today and 100,000 Ukrainian casualties, 700,000, and Russian 100,000, then you have this ratio of 1 to 7. So this is consistent with what Danilov said. But the Europeans apparently tend to forget that. So they make war with a country that, in fact, they make war with the blood of the Ukrainians. And that shows how the West is, in fact, cheating here in that context, and how the West is hypocritical when it comes to this whole issue. Regardless of what you think about Putin, Zelensky, whoever, whether they are good or bad, this is not the question. The fact of the matter is that people are dying for nothing. And we know that. And we know that the sanctions that we have applied to Russia, they probably affected in some way Russia, but they are ineffective in the sense that they are not achieving the objective that they were supposed to achieve. As a result, we wage a war that we know is pointless, with an approach which is equally pointless, and the only victims of that are, in fact, the Ukrainians. And that, in my view, explains exactly why we are so doomed, in fact. And at the end of the day, the Russians will probably win this war, but the cost and the price paid by Ukraine will be enormous. And remember that in March or April 2022, as you had an agreement that was about to be signed by both parties based on a proposal from the Ukrainians. Remember that was a proposal by the Ukrainians that the Russians agreed, were ready to sign when the Europeans asked Zelensky to withdraw the proposal. At that time, you had probably only 60,000 dead on the Ukrainian side. Meaning that today this number has been multiplied by 10 for nothing, because Ukraine has got absolutely nothing. They got weapons and all that, but they gained no more territory. They had no strategic gains. They lost. And that what was the result of the European policy towards Ukraine. Instead of acknowledging from the very beginning, and that's the reason, remember that Zelensky asked already on the 25th of February, that mean 1 day after the beginning of a special military operation, Zelensky asked the Swiss foreign minister to organize a peace conference because he understood that the reaction of Russia, that was anticipated, but probably not in that size. The size of the Russian response surprised the Ukrainians. And I think Zelensky realized that he launched something that he could not master. And for that reason, he wanted to start this peace process. This peace process, eventually the conference was not made in Switzerland, but you had a negotiation process that started in Gomel at the Belarus-Ukrainian border. Eventually was stopped by the European Union. European Union stopped the process once. And then Zelensky resumed or restarted with a more concrete proposal in March 2022. And that gave the occasion of the Istanbul process that was stopped by the Europeans also. So the Europeans, in fact, played with the Ukrainians. Zelensky has realized at that time that he was playing a game that Ukraine was not able to play, and certainly not to win. He understood that. But somehow the Europeans convinced Zelensky that with the help and the support of the Europeans and the Western at large, Ukraine could probably win this conflict. And that's the reason why at the end the Ukraine continued in a war process rather than a peace process. But that shows how the West has played a very negative role in the whole history. And I would, if I were Ukrainian, I would be extremely angry at the Europeans. Extremely angry.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Carl, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
That was my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
My pleasure.